that time of the year when friends and families reunite and come together to celebrate the festive season. This occasion also means that many will splash on food and other luxuries. However, others of the country's poor may also face starvation due to lack of access to affordable basic foods. According to Stats SA, at least 2.1 million South Africans experienced hunger in 2021. And so tonight we ask, is the high price of food in South Africa justifiable? Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm your host, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. NGOs and farmers are accusing food retailers of pricing the poor out of basic foods through exorbitant pricing. There's a call for proper regulation of food prices and to reduce anti-competitive behavior by big retailers. For this discussion, we're joined by the Chief Economist and Deputy Commissioner of the Competition Commission, James Hodge, as well as Development Economist Pelisa Nkomo. And on Zoom, we're joined by Mr. Mervyn Abrahams, who will be joining us later in the show. Remember to join this discussion online on X using the handle @Unfiltered SABC. And let's dive straight into our conversation with you, Mr. Hodge. And can you just give us a sense of the lay of the land in terms of food prices? How bad are things, and is it getting better or worse?
Well, it has been pretty dismal since really the start of COVID. Food inflation has topped over 10% per annum. But that doesn't tell the whole story. If you look at the breakdown of food inflation, really it's your basic staples, your fruit and veg, your maize meal, your cooking oil, your bread, all have much higher levels of inflation than the average. And so it has hit the poor more, and that's compounded obviously by the fact that low-income households have to spend a lot more of their income on food just to survive. We've seen during this period that people have had to cut back on nutritional foods in order to make the budget balance at the end of the day. And that has resulted in growing malnutrition. You've mentioned hunger already. So things are starting to get better, and certainly there were a lot of shocks to the global economy and the local economy that did affect the cost base of food production. But the problem is in South Africa, we have a highly concentrated market at the retail level, at the food processing level, also at the provision of the inputs to farmers. And so what we've seen over this period is a lot of opportunistic behavior. And it's not South Africa alone that's seen this. Globally, we've seen it where firms use the excuse of cost increases. Well, you've seen the Ukraine war. Of course, prices must go up, but there's no transparency as to how much they should go up and what's fair. And so we've been tracking this since the beginning of COVID, and every time we do a report, there's some product where the profits and the margins have increased. It may be for a short period, and then it normalizes, but it happens. So maybe on is it getting better? Yes, farm gate prices are coming down fast. Things are starting to return, and overall inflation is certainly lower. But we're not seeing it at the retail shelf, and that's the problem. That is the real problem.
Absolutely. Ms. Nkomo, do you share that analysis, and can you tell us anything further about just where we are with this very basic necessity within an economy?
No, absolutely. I share exactly the same sentiment. And I think what happens is that families are actually not able to capture some of these decreases in terms of food prices. But also fundamentally, what also is happening is the fact that you have families who have no access to income. So in essence, you have one person or two persons who are actually working, who are earning less than a living wage, right? Or one person works, but also an elder who actually earns the old age grant. They have to support between 6 to 8 people in the families. So in essence, it means that so if the cost of food is higher, and it means that it's actually an economic leakage within those families. So that's the first. I think the second issue as well is the fact that you don't see a much more coordinated interventions around food-related interventions. Of course, there's one that is progressive, and I'll talk about it later. When I'm talking about coordinated, for example, we're seeing an increased urban poverty we hear that, almost between 60 to 65% of South Africans are starting to move to the cities. So that economic migration and urbanization, which in some quarters gets celebrated, but in fact traps people into a lot more poverty. Because if they can address basic food, it means that they're not going to be able to lead productive lives. One of the other things, by the way, I discovered just 2 weeks ago that apparently South Africa has not signed up for World Food Programme for support, even though, they have the whole membership. And part of the argument they're making is that we don't have a food crisis in South Africa. And that's actually quite problematic because data shows that almost 14.2 million South Africans have to decide whether to take a breakfast, to take lunch, or to take dinner. And in between that, they will have to take lunch to keep them in between the morning and even the evening meal. So obviously that has massive implication. Even the fourth one, interestingly, just a year or 2 years ago, the panel that was looking at tax increases discovered that just above 11% of children in South Africa are stunting, right? And obviously it means that while they might have access to food, but the quality of food that they have access to is actually really problematic. And obviously, and I think so when we then argue, it's important to present very strong economic argument, but also there's a human rights issue here that we really need to think about it.
Indeed. And I will come back to that because I think the human rights angle of this is important. But Mr. Hodge, can I also just, based on what Ms. Nkomo has also said, come back to the question of the responsibility that corporations who have this vast control over our market and ultimately control over the price of food that people eat. Can you unpack for us the extent to which they are, as you say, perhaps taking advantage of the external shocks to create a narrative for their own enrichment? Or maybe even, is there collusive or evidence of collusive practice?
Well, yes, and as it's World Competition Day today, it is appropriate to talk about these competition issues. I mean, we have seen over the years very high-profile cases of collusion. But I think as we look at what's happening now, it's the level of concentration, which means people can take advantage. And the whole point is, I mean, we saw this, a good example last year. When the Ukraine war broke out, they're a big supplier of sunflower seed. So we were told cooking oil is going to go up. When we checked this in about August of that year, sunflower seeds in South Africa had not gone up in price because we're self-sufficient. But the cooking oil price from the producers had gone up 50%. We highlighted this, went to the press. That weekend, there were specials across retail, and prices have subsequently come down. But when they came down, the retailers didn't drop it as fast as the processors then. So the first problem was the processors, then we had a problem with the retailers. It's come down now, and that's positive. But in fact, sunflower seed is dropping even further at the moment, and we're not seeing a response to that. Maize meal down almost 25% this year. The producer level, retail level, no change. So there is clearly some profiteering taking place here, and we're seeing it globally, and they call it this rocket and feather effect, which is prices are quick to rise. You've got a cost excuse. But there's no transparency, so you don't know how much it's meant to go up. You just know you're meant to face an increase and you accept it, either as consumer or retailer buying from a processor. And then the feather is, of course, it's slow to come down. And so those are pockets of profiteering that can take place. It doesn't mean that there's constant profiteering, but there's pockets of it that mean consumers aren't getting the full benefit. But I think the problem is there's not an honest debate in this country about this issue. So whenever we raise it and whenever others raise it, we get the same story. You're not acknowledging there's cost increases. We ask, well, how much does that justify the price? And there's silence. And so you're right, Cicely, we need to have that debate with the corporation. They have the economic power. They need to come and be accountable to the public because it may be good for their shareholders. They can protect themselves from uncertainty in the global economy. But the consumers are helpless and are not protected at all.
It's a really interesting point, Ms. Ngoma. And of course, feel free to respond to anything Mr. Hodge has said. But it's an interesting point in terms of even the debate about inflation more widely, because we're often told about these drivers of inflation, but never told that actually corporate profit is a big driver of inflation. And corporations may just push things as far as they think they can go, which may not actually have a basis in the underlying prices. And then, interest rates respond to inflation. And so we're actually not really going back and thinking, hold on a second, what is actually behind the high level of inflation, and to what extent are private interests driving that?
Yeah, you're spot on. In fact, one of the things, for example, particularly the agricultural sector, supermarket are so vertically integrated. So there's a lot of price transfers that really takes place. So in essence, and that's the point you're making around transparency. So obviously, there's always going to be room for abuse of market power and domination. The agricultural sector in South Africa is dominated by less than 8 to 10 companies who really from primary production right into the fork in the table, where they're completely involved. And I do think that one of the key things that we really need to start doing, and I was saying, just offline to Mr. James, that amongst the things we need to do, we need to start building from the bottom. Part of it is that I think there needs to be a very clear mobilization for people to start using the piece of land they have to produce food, because that's how you're going to be able to weaken the market power, and they're going to start listening. So without that clear mobilization, you're not going to be able to deal with the market power. The second thing, in fact, recently I discovered that the Department of Agriculture and Land is actually partnering with the Anglican Church, in particularly using churches as a social infrastructure to start using their land to actually produce food. Obviously, that's going to require coordination. But obviously, part of what you're going to have to deal with, it's a number of things in South Africa. So it's the fact that, so if you're having this such increased economic migration, people moving in the city, hoping to look for jobs, and the issue of access to land, it's just one thing, because that land has to be serviced so that you're able to produce food. But also the other opportunity to really start using some of the arable land that is located in rural areas to mobilize and really support. And that's where, in fact, you actually need a much more clear, agricultural architecture and thinking and intentional coordination. You have critical stakeholders there. Firstly, you have traditional leaders. You have, a local government. You have what you call councillors. You have civil society organizations. Part of the organization that I chair, the board of Oxfam, we have a program called Livelihoods. Amongst the key things we do is that we're working with communities. But what we've seen there is what you call linear thinking and planning. So if we fund, for example, a community with seeds and some implements, they need road infrastructure, they need water, etc. And then one department will just come and build road infrastructure, and then they will have implements. So I think part of what the food crisis in South Africa demands is a multidisciplinary approach in dealing with food insecurity. Because, and that's how then part of that multidisciplinary planning at public policy level, both in terms of thinking and allocation of resources, and as well as coordination, will actually be able to deal with it. And then you also even make the work of the commission much more easier, because then in essence you have this structured intervention, mobilization of citizens around food production, but also then competition commission is going to monitor the abuse of market power consistently, and at that point they will actually see now exactly, and there's going to be a lot more transparency, because you're going to be breaking that vertical integration.
Right, absolutely. Let's leave it there for now. We're going to go to a break. We're talking about food prices and the price of food on your table, on South Africans' table, as we enter the festive season. We know that the crisis of hunger is a serious crisis in South Africa, and a lot of that has to do with exactly where the price of food sits. When we come back, we'll also look at what are some of the regulatory interventions that can be explored to protect South Africans, especially the poorest South Africans, from food price inflation. Stick with us.
At work, when OUTsurance contacted me, it was very quick and easy. The whole process was so smooth. I didn't need to go for any medical tests, and I didn't need to complete any paperwork. I contacted so many other financial institutions, and OUTsurance gave me the best value for money. OUTsurance is there to make my life as well as my daughter's life so much easier.
SMS Live to 44202 for fast, easy, instant cover.
This is a demonstration that business has been active in wanting to destroy South Africa. Because when you manipulate the rand, you want the economy of the country to collapse, and that those businesses were not run by patriots. And it continues, and it's not unique to that period. There are things that business is doing now to undermine the economy and the standing of this country. And we're not saying there are no patriotic business people who are working with government to build and rebuild this country and the economy better. But what has been happening, specific to the rand manipulation, the Competition Commission has been engaging, because if you are following up, is it 28 banks and financial institutions that are at play, you need to have a solid case. So you need to then incentivize some to come and become state witnesses so that you can have evidence to prosecute the others. And the pace at which, if you recall, this was 2015. The time is taking, it shows the matter is complex. And they say they are confident now that they can take the matter to prosecution so that they can hold those who have not come forward to account and continue to deal with the penalties of the others.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're talking food prices in South Africa and how we can insulate particularly the poorest South Africans against rising food costs as we enter the festive period. Let's take a look at a graphic now which shows us the national basic nutritious diet for a family per month. And you'll see that households with 4 members require 3,700 Rand a month. With 5 members, it rises to 4,600, and with 7 members, about 6,500. And you can see the costs and the requirements for different families. And Mr. Hodge, I wonder if we could come to you, because you alluded to the differential impact of rising food prices on different households. What is this differential impact?
Well, I think for your poorest households, food, as you can see, can take up almost all your income, quite frankly. But I think on average for the bottom 10%, it's over 40% is spent on food. And then transport, which has also seen high inflation. Whereas your top 10%, spend less than 5% of their income on food. And as I said, a lot of the food that's been really struck by abnormally high inflation has been the staples. So it has had a completely disproportionate impact on low-income households. And I think what's interesting, you mentioned profit-led inflation. We always fret in an inflationary environment about, well, wages shouldn't follow. I mean, it's wages that are not necessarily driving this inflation, and why wages should be sacrificed when the cost of living is going up makes no sense in this environment. There should be, as I said, that debate about profit levels and a social pact around just ensuring that corporate behavior is fair.
Absolutely, and this is linked to the human rights point, Ms. Nkoma, that you were making earlier, because when a family can't afford food, that moves from being an economic and a budgetary household question to a question of dignity, a question of the right to life in extreme cases.
No, in fact, it's a contravention of Section 9 of the Constitution, which really talks about, access to equitable, but also which guarantees some form of certain living standards, which amongst those is actually access to good quality food. In fact, I know today we're not talking about healthcare, but there's a direct correlation between the quality of food that citizens have and the type of disease and public health demands or burden that it has. So if, for instance, you have, almost 2 or 3 decades where people don't have access to good quality food, the implications is that they're going to start queuing up for chronic medication, but also means that they're going to become less active in the economy very early. So their proactiveness, meaning that quite early they're likely to retire due to a chronic disease. But also it means that they're not going to be able to support their families. So it means that then you're triggering a potential intergenerational poverty, because then it means that if they would have to retire at age 41 or 42 because they've actually not been feeling well or they are really sickly, it means that immediately all the family members have to come into the public sector support or social security system, and we know that the social security system is very minimal in terms of support. And I think exactly the point I was making, that we need to really start thinking, multidisciplinary when we're starting to plan around those things. So as long as we still have a very vague and weak, food production, policy regime that really supports it, you're likely to allow corporates, for example, to maximum profits. For example, the point I was making earlier, why would, in the context where you have 32.9% of South Africans who are unemployed, as part of that is a conservative definition of unemployment. If you extend that, we're probably even sitting at 52%. So the rest are in the informal sector. They're selling tomato, onion, potatoes, apples. You don't even know what they take home with. So under those circumstances, you fundamentally need programs like the UN World Food Programme to really help actually galvanize citizens and build that. But part of the thinking and the decision from government is to protect the very same retailers. And when you protect them amongst those, that you systemically make it sure that interventions that seeks to empower the poor are actually minimized, because it's part of advancing what you call your neoliberal macroeconomic policy. And it's so implicit, so you have to read in between the lines. You tell me if today, Gauteng, for example, has about 5 million people who go to school, who go to bed without food. It contributes 2.2 trillion to the GDP. What a contrast, right? So immediately it speaks volumes about how this economy is organized and whether fundamentally it actually seeks to insulate those who would have been excluded, which is Africans, black people, women. I'm a feminist economist. I cannot talk about the genderedness of food security. By the way, I was saying to James Ayler, I have to bemoan the fact that we're talking about food security and I'm the only person in the panel, and you have 3 men who are talking about it. And women interface with food more than 3 times a day, both in buying, in preparation, even in making a decision on what needs to be eaten. So in essence, so there's a massive genderness component, because then I think also what data is showing up from State SA is that we have an increased female-headed households in South Africa who are actually leading and making decisions on a daily basis. So it's them who have to really look at this, scramble between these resources about what needs to be eaten by children and at what time and what type of lunch. So meaning amongst the intervention that the state needs to do, that school nutritional program is very important to make sure that you deal with stunting, and when children are not able to have access to good quality nutritional food at home, but the school nutritional program could actually really step in as a trade-off. And I don't even want to go there about the quality of food that children are eating at school.
Indeed. Mr. Hodge, Ms. Nkomo has spoken about the wider effects on the economy and the costs of high food prices, ironically, and also the not only the distributional effects in terms of the poorest households, but also gender, race in South Africa as well. How do you respond to that intervention?
Yeah, I think it's spot on, and I think the call for a more systematic program is also important. We have inherited this highly commercialized model with large farms, limited access to land for the majority of the population. And that model is very vulnerable to the type of shocks we've seen in the past few years and the ongoing shocks. So the oil price in particular drives up the price of logistics, it drives up the price of fertilizer. But for instance, the University of Johannesburg has shown that more urban agriculture that uses food waste as fertilizer, has short logistics, direct to market, can be as cost effective, if not cheaper, than some of what's driven through these big retailers and their giant warehouses and their distribution centers.
Long distances of travel.
Exactly. And so I think, it is about access to land. And we've sort of explored this as well. There's land that mines have above ground that's not being used. There's land in government, but of course the land question is far bigger than that, especially in the urban area. But we need to unleash that, and I think about how we restructure our agricultural sector as well to make it more resilient against these shocks, because it's also the climate issue, and that affects sort of global supply, but also sometimes local as well. And so how do you make it resilient? How do you bring food closer to people, make them less dependent on buying from a retailer, more independent? I think these are all important questions we have to take forward.
And just to stick with you briefly, because what you're making me realize as well, and just the conversation, is that from land, which is hyper-concentrated, to the logistics, which is hyper-concentrated, to the retailers, which is hyper-concentrated. We have this hyper-concentrated supply chain from top to bottom, which is controlled by basically whatever companies say the price should be. And that seems to be a very dangerous and precarious place to have an entire food value chain.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, the conversation has to go about resilience, but also competition. So, you know, when we did the grocery retail market inquiry, we identified that all the major retailers had exclusive leases that shut out any small business, any black-owned business, even a simple greengrocer, you know, butchery. And once you took it across the Spar Group, the Pick and Pay, and the ShopRite, we're talking a few thousand locations. I mean, it's a countrywide. Now, if where you want to go buy food, there's no competitor, no wonder you can push prices up at that. Now, we have fortunately reached settlement agreements with all of them to start to remove those, and with immediate effect on small business and black-owned businesses.
Interesting.
But we're still left with a structure that this has been around for a while. It's going to take time to change. You know, in food processing, again, we see high levels of concentration, as you point out, and that gives this opportunity for profiteering. So we do have to look at, I suppose, a range of instruments to deal with this. There may be sort of, we use monitoring to try and detect and snuff out the short-term profiteering. But fundamentally changing the structure and addressing deep competition issues is going to take time, and it takes more sophisticated instruments. So we're using market inquiries around food. We have a fresh produce market inquiry now. We're likely to have more in the food area because it's so important. But I think, you know, what is important is that this is a coordinated approach amongst government that brings the different elements, because we can open up a shopping centre to competitors, but if there's not financing for business, if there's not access to land for new farmers to emerge, then we're going to have the same problems. So we do need to sort of, I think, look at a strategy on food that can transform.
Absolutely. Let's cut to a break. We're talking about the high price of food in South Africa linked to the crisis of hunger and how we emerge from those dual crises. We'll be back after the break to explore some of the regulatory mechanisms that can be used, as well as have a look at the interaction between food prices and wages. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're talking food prices in South Africa, particularly as we enter the festive season, and the way that these food prices can disproportionately affect the poorest households in South Africa. Mr. Hodge, can I stay with you? Because, of course, there was the notorious bread cartel, which the Competition Commission was involved with around 2010. What do you think the experience with bread prices and the bread cartel, which you exposed and were central to exposing, has to tell us about this period of high food inflation that we face?
Well, I think as soon as you have concentrated markets, you have much higher risk of cartel conduct. But what was fascinating about the bread cartel is, in essence, it was one of market division. So we'll close our bakery here and let you have that area, and you close here. Right. And so in a sense, it also entrenched a market structure, which in fact is less competitive. So it has long-term effects as well. So obviously detecting the cartel, stopping it was critically important. But this is the problem, you know, we inherited a structure from the apartheid era that doesn't change fast. a cartel like that would do the same. We see in many areas this sort of geographic specialization. Poultry, we see it in dairy, where you can have localized pockets of market power as well. And so almost some of the conduct from the past filters through to the present. Even your sort of cooperatives, you know, they were public. They were meant to sponsor the farmers in the area, and then they were privatized, and now it's private interests. But they're localized monopolies. We have repeated issues with things like grain silo, storage prices, and the like. So we do have a structural problem in many respects in food.
Absolutely. Ms. Nkomo, interesting to hear how the bread cartel revealed the different ways in which cartel behavior can manifest. Any thoughts on what Mr. Hodge says? And I know that you also wanted to intervene on the earlier question that we were discussing around wages and the interaction.
Yes, so I just want to build. I mean, I think the point that he's making around the vulnerability of the system is something that really South Africans must pay attention to. Because while we might be seen as a, quite a conglomerated, structured economy, but obviously the risk is that every time there are these exogenous shocks, there's a sneezing that takes place, and that sneezing affect directly citizens at home, right, or households at home, and they're struggling to live, to live their lives. But I think one of the things that conversation, why it's actually important, is that in fact it does affect corporates as well, right? And that's why it's a conversation that needs to take place amongst themselves. And I do think that the Competition Commission, I think Mr. James, they can explain whether they have, space where they can facilitate open conversation in areas that are critical as food security issues. Let's talk about oil, let's talk about milk, let's talk about bread, we have 2.5 million South Africans who actually lost jobs during COVID. And in fact, we've been, even before pre-COVID, we've had so many people that have been unemployed in this country. So what would really be your contribution? So I do think that that's something. And I think the second issue within that conversation is to also talk about, and I would assume that civil society organizations would need to participate in that conversation, because there's a social cost associated with extractive relationships between corporates and citizens, right? And now we're seeing a lot of implosion in various communities. And part of that implosion may not be entirely about food as such, but also it's the whole structure of the economy that is actually quite exclusionary. So people have no access to opportunities. So what they do is that they turn against each other, right?
Could I just stick with you on that, because I'm interested in, we have an election coming up, and we have this crisis of hunger and food prices, but it seems that even political parties also play a key role in our society, aren't foregrounding this question. And I would expect to see parties actually being able to say to citizens, this is how we actually, never mind economic ideology for 1 minute, this is how we're going to put food on your table. This is how we're going to give you access to food. And it's interesting that problem hasn't been framed as a political priority on various sides of the political spectrum.
That's quite interesting. And I think part of it has to do, by the way, that I think the food sector, while it's organized, it's not really been strong enough. Follow my thought process. We've actually been, I carry another hat around where we've been demanding for gender-based violence to actually be recognized as a political issue. What it took young women and women of this country to the streets, to parliament, demanding that there must be resource allocation, there must be integrated planning that takes place, but also that both civil society organizations, private sector, and government must really talk, because this is a crisis. So this is exactly the same crisis that we're confronted with. And I do think that what South Africans must do is to take a very similar approach. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from gender-based violence and femicide civil society organization in how they actually demanded that this issue be a political party. I mean, the point you're making, I'm really can't wait to see the political party manifestos in the next 5 to 6 weeks. In fact, once the ANC launches theirs on the 8th of January, we're going to start seeing that. And it would be quite keen to see whether actually political parties are really prioritizing, food security as a issue. Because, there are multiplier effects, by the way, in food security. Because food security is not only about eating, but also it creates jobs. It creates stability at household level and at community level. And what it does is that it actually kind of like contributes in some form of coherent thinking, right? And particularly if you use the theory of Ubuntu to organize communities. But of course, one of the key things that we've seen, over the years is that a neoliberal system has become quite entrenched in public governance system. And what it has done is that it has demobilized communities. So everyone in communities would say, we're waiting for government. But then actually, if you get 20 to 30 people and use the piece of land and start producing food, actually without waiting for government. It's true, police has to be there, they must be able to support, but that demobilization, you said, it's so glaring.
Indeed, and Mr. Hodge, of course, feel free to react to anything that's been said, but I suppose in terms of the regulatory environment, what kind of levers can be pulled to ameliorate this problem of high food prices? Of course, the Competition Commission has its own levers, but I'm sure there are other things that can be done outside the economy. Sometimes I feel like the Commission is a victim of its own success to some extent, because you identify problems and then everyone says, well, why haven't you also fixed the problem you identified? But what kind of regulatory interventions could help this crisis, as Ms. Nkomo says?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and you're right. The Commission bears a lot of responsibility, but as a public agency serving citizens, we rightly are held to account and should be. And there's a lot we try to do, but there are limits to our act and our powers.
Sure.
I think what is fascinating, is that a lot of the infrastructure around agriculture was almost dismantled at the end of apartheid through the World Trade Organization agreement to end subsidies, end agricultural support programs. So programs that were there, for instance, in generating new open variety seeds for different crops. But those institutions' support measures and all of that were incremental in building the agricultural sector in the first place. And now they're taken away, and in many respects, at a time when we need to bring in emerging black farmers into the sector, change the structure, and look at that. We need to look at those measures as well. It's always a problem because it draws on the fiscus, and so many things draw on the fiscus. And at a time when the fiscus is under stress, it is difficult. But those are almost public interventions, so almost the community type interventions, which is collectively we can develop something rather than trying to do it individually. And cooperation is one of the tools. And so whilst we are the competition agency, we also recognize that there is a role for cooperation, especially amongst individuals and small businesses, in order to pool their resources, pool their buying power, and create that cooperation. So there is a sort of block exemption for SMEs on that front. But I think we have to be creative and look at it. And I think that challenge of climate change resilience is something we have to now build into the system, because we are going to face frequent shocks. Since COVID, so the pandemic aside, droughts, floods, fires have caused massive mayhem in global markets, and they're not abating. It's just happening constantly.
And of course that affects food and food security.
Exactly. So there's that aspect that we need to now build in, because it may be not having the lowest price today, but having a stable price might be more desirable in the long run.
Absolutely. We're talking food prices in South Africa, which have seen precipitous rises since the COVID period. We're asking exactly what's behind this, and after the break, in our final segment, we're going to ask how we can take the most important steps and what those steps are to resolving this problem. Stay with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. What's behind high food prices and how can we slow the rise of food prices in South Africa? We've been joined by an expert panel of economists to discuss this. And Mr. Abrams, thank you for joining us. Your organization has been closely monitoring food prices, particularly in urban areas. And as we come to the close of our discussion, Could you share some of your insights in terms of what can be done to stop the rise of food prices and how you think we can intervene to make it so that the poorest families, particularly in South Africa, can get greater access to this basic necessity?
So I think the first step and the first realization we need to make is that the food system is embedded in a larger economic system. So in terms of the long-term solutions, it's also to do with the general economy. So it also has to do with issues like wages. It has to do with transforming the food system, as well as households having sufficient income in order to save, because food inflation and spikes in food prices are generally a part of the normal system. And the difficulty in South Africa is that we do not have the savings that we can draw on at times when food prices spike. So that's the long-term issues. But in terms of the immediate solution, and we know that about, a number of almost 20% of South Africans are not eating enough sufficient and nutritious food. So we have to find a way in which we can assist farmers in order to bring down their input costs, so that some of those costs do not multiply through the system. And then we also need to ask about transparency in the manufacturing sector as to, are some of these price increases justified or not? And I think that's also an area where we need to look in order to ensure that households are able to feed themselves in the short term.
Absolutely. Mr. Hodge, in terms of solutions to this problem, you alluded to it in the previous segment. Anything that Mr. Abrams has said that you would agree with or disagree with, and any other solutions that you think can be proposed?
Look, I think I think some of the solutions are similar. We need to look at the structure, but there's also short-term interventions. I think we also should recognise that a lot is being done. I mean, things like the school feeding schemes, the 350 Rand grant, all are beneficial in helping the situation.
Sure.
But we also need to have a conversation as society. I feel at the moment there's a sort of, there's a sort of almost antagonism between corporate South Africa and government that is not making a positive sort of solution-driven approach. I mean, it was interesting at the beginning of COVID, there was a lot of cooperation, but that seems to have dissipated. And so, getting to look at these and solving them together, I think is going to be something that we do need to do and have an honest conversation from all sides.
When you say that, for some reason, the slogan of "Stronger Together" came to mind. And, it's easy to unite as a nation when there's, a spectacle. But how do we as a nation, let alone government, allow so many people to go hungry every night? And wouldn't just basic social solidarity mean that as a society we just don't let that happen?
That's true.
Yeah.
Yes, in fact, I really can step in there, is that one of the key things, particularly around how do we build from a momentum of COVID, is that you need to have champions that hold the space. And normally in this context, government has to hold the space, where, for example, the very same energy and spirit and attitude of collaboration, and setting aside differences needs to really, come in, but also start building genuine relationships, not relationships that are based on, crisis or transactional relations, because that's what actually happens with COVID. Because now, if you assess the type of human and social solidarity that emerged during COVID, it's like, it was just transactional. It was a moment and that moment. And I think the issue of leadership is important. I think that's the second issue I want to make is that, there are 4 factors of production we mentioned in economy when you want to build a resilient economy. One is technical knowledge, expertise, it's land, access to infrastructure, it's finance, and of course it's energy now and probably mobile data. And one of the key things you need to start looking at these variables, you then need to start breaking them down and say, what has been happening in the last 30 years of democratic dispensation? We have a generation that is completely not exposed and has no relationship with land, no agricultural system, which is the point that Mervyn is making, that there's a correlation between food production and the economic system. But of course, there's always going to be an opportunity. If we're having this conversation today and we decide tomorrow to do some work and begin to say, let's really try and get young people to actually build a relationship with land, because that's the generation that is going to be able to produce food for both household but as well as for the economy, to particularly reduce the vulnerability based on exogenous shocks that you have no interest into. So, and we do risk, and if we don't make this very intentional intervention, we risk having younger generation who have no relation with land, but also fundamentally who just relate with the economy through either selling their labor in the market, which in fact already we're talking about issues around the fact that there's lack of concomitant increase in wages, while in fact, cost of living is on the rise. So in essence, government needs to really come into the part. And I think from civil society, we've already been raising our hands and saying these multiple crises that South Africa is confronted with, some of them we can resolve it within ourselves. And we're very strong institutions that can actually start that work.
Indeed. Mr. Abrams, how do you respond to some of the proposals that have come through? Mr. Hodge and Ms. Nkomo make really important points about the fact that this is something that needs to excite the imagination of the whole of society across different divides.
Exactly, and I would fully agree with the suggestions that's been made, particularly with us beginning to find a way to connect to the land. There are numbers of things that we can do, perhaps not on massive, large scale, but, in communities, we can begin to grow some food. We can have community markets around our taxi ranks. There are ways to introduce small-scale, community-level farming into our systems rather than only depending on the main retail stores. So in a way, it is like to take back the power that we can in order to change. There is also things like, for instance, changing mindsets. It is very useful to buy vegetables around the taxi ranks. You can buy 3 tomatoes rather than going into the store and buying a kg of tomatoes. You can get the kind of vegetables you need. Can we begin as a nation to say that we need to feed ourselves and we can do it, and then begin to take the steps to do that?
Absolutely. Let's have a look at some of the comments that have been made on social media. We have Malins who says we should go back to basics and each household should start their own little vegetable garden. The price of vegetables is too much. A bag of potatoes is like buying a kilo of meat. Offet says the current food prices are too high unless it's the unhealthy food. Spatlo Amagwinya. Even morojo is expensive. The food retailers are evil, wanting max profit, whatever it takes. At my ANC is shareholder to these evil companies. And finally, John says, no, they are not. It all started when Russia attacked Ukraine. Crude oil went from plus minus $75 to plus minus 137 per VAT. Fuel, transport costs, and retail prices, quote, went through the ceiling and are still way out of line. Income of the working class did not increase. Pensions remained the same. And I think that's our final social media comment for this evening. Any responses to some of the intriguing social media views, Mr. Hodge?
Well, I think this last one just highlights almost the problem of the conversation we're having in the media is, yes, it was a Ukraine war. Yes, the fuel price went up. But does that mean that what we're paying is fair? And what we are finding is it's absolutely not. And what's fascinating is through this value chain of people, logistics, agents and others, everyone adds their percentage margin. And what was fascinating when we had 1 year into COVID, the ginger and garlic crisis, you may recall. And that was a climate event in China, drought, ginger was scarce. But it went from a cost of around 40 Rand a kilo at the Joburg market to 200 Rand. Everyone still kept adding their percent. So by the time it got to the retailers, they were making 100 Rand on a kilogram of ginger. And we said to them, how is that fair? You know, the cost of your shelf space and your labor hasn't gone up fivefold. You were making 20 Rand. Let's not work in percentages, let's work in absolute rands. And that is also what we need to consider in this context, because we like to think, well, I'm still adding only 5%, that's fair. But when the cost has gone up so much, it's no longer fair.
Absolutely. I wonder whether those increases were transferred to the workers who worked in the retailers, or whether they were just, it's a really important point about exactly where these profits go as well, not just whether they're made. We just have a few minutes to go, Ms. Nkomo, but I'll allow you and Mr. Abrams in a minute or so to just give your final thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think for me, now that we have elections coming up, I think South Africans must really start demanding that this should be part of the political agenda, that South Africans, you can't have such a rich country as South Africa and you still have more than 14 million people going to bed. So that's the first issue. And then the second issue is to really build movement at a community level, where people are starting to use the land to actually produce food. I know one political party had actually called South Africans to occupy land. We're starting to sing that. But then we actually need a similar call that you use the land in a way that will actually not only be productive, because also, you know, food production is not only about just feeding, but also there's commercial aspects into it. And there's so much learning, by the way, and particularly if you get young people involved. So, but also then you need government, private sector and civil society to really start collaborating and also supporting those initiatives on the ground.
Absolutely. And Mr. Abrams, we'll end with you and some of your final thoughts.
So really, to bring to mind the fact that food is not only for our energy, food, in fact, our economy, the future of South Africa is built on the plate of food that we feed people, because its impact is on education, its impact is on productivity, its impact is on health, its impact is just about on every aspect of life. So making sure that South Africans have access to sufficient and nutritious food is critically important for the future of the country. Having said that, we then have to create the systems to shift the food system in such a way that food is affordable for all South Africans.
Indeed. Mr. Abrams, thank you so much for your time. Ms. Nkomo and Mr. Hodge, thank you for a fascinating conversation and sharing your considerable insights with us on this question. So many South Africans still go to bed hungry each night, not knowing where their next meal will come from. Those who have a meal maybe have to choose between breakfast or lunch or supper. And this is a sad indictment on the state of our nation. As we enter the festive period, in this show we've asked what is behind high food prices, but also how can we stem the tide of rising food prices and make sure in the medium and long term that South Africans actually have the food they need to thrive and live the lives that they wish to live. Thank you very much for joining us on Unfiltered for another episode of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.